Spoilers inbound. Watch out and take care. In Hudson Valley, a small suburb town, 11-year-old genius Henry and his younger brother Peter stand by the roadside, waiting for school bus, just as the bus arrives. The brothers opt in and out of nowhere. A boy pushes Peter without paying the bully. Henry quickly picks his brother up in school. Henry's class has been asked to speak on the topic, My Legacy. When it's Henry's turn, he delivers an insightful speech on what legacy really means, and just as he finishes his presentation, the bell rings as the other students leaves the classroom. Henry and his teacher discuss the idea of him attending a school for the gifted. Henry and Peter wait after school for their mother, Susan, to pick them up. While they wait, Henry uses the school phone to monitor his stock market investments. Susan eventually shows up, apologizes for her delay, and drives them home in her rickety old car. When they got home, Henry and Peter retreated to their tree house where Henry assembles a Rube Goldberg machine. At night, Susan runs a bath for Peter and then retires to the living room to play video games. Meanwhile, Henry goes over their monthly financial statement with her and suggests she at least look over their account documents, but she completely ignores him. Later that night, Susan reads them a children's book she wrote in their shared bedroom, and Henry teases her about the storyline. After the book reading, Susan informs Peter that they will not be able to have a movie night the next day because she has to work the dinner shift. Hearing this, Henry informs his mother that she is no longer expected to work as a waitress. But she ignores him and walks away after kissing them. Susan makes breakfast for the boys the next morning, but their quiet meal is interrupted when their neighbor Glenn yells out her name. Susan walks out, accompanied by her two sons, and Glenn tells her not to let her unranked leaves fall on his lawn. Glenn's stepdaughter Christina, who is also Henry's classmate, comes out to greet Henry after the matter has been resolved. Susan makes a joke about Henry's obvious crush on Christina as the trio heads back inside. After breakfast, Susan goes to the ice cream parlor, where she and her best friend Sheila work as waitresses after exchanging pleasantries. Susan's boss approaches her to discuss her preferred payment method, rather than simply selecting one. She responds that she would have to consult Henry first. The next day at school, Peter comes running up to Henry while he is playing checkers. He asks for his assistance in retrieving a medal that Maurice, the school's notorious bully, has taken. Henry immediately follows Peter to the school courtyard. But, as Peter walks over to Maurice, Henry notices Christina sitting alone and stops to make small talk in the time it takes Henry to talk to Christina. Maurice breaks the medal and begins to rough Peter up. Noticing the commotion, Henry goes to save his brother, but instead of being grateful, Peter is enraged, questioning where he was in the first place. Back at home, Peter is still angry with Henry, but Henry eventually cheers him up with a makeshift snow machine, while the siblings continue to play in the simulated snow. Susan returns home with Sheila after Sheila greets Peter and chats briefly with Henry. She follows Susan into the living room, where the two women get drunk and make jokes until bedtime. Henry puts his younger brother, Peter, to bed. At midnight, Henry awakens unexpectedly and, after taking pain relievers, walks over to his bedroom window, which overlooks the house next door. Looking out the window, Henry notices a suspicious situation involving Christina and her stepfather, Glenn, who became her guardian after her mother died the next day at breakfast. Henry is visibly upset by what he has seen, but when Susan asks what's wrong, he says he has a headache when it's time to drop the kids off at school. Susan sees Christina sitting on her front house and offers her a ride in the car. Henry asks Christina if she is all right, but she ignores him. In class, Henry's teacher announces that there will be a talent show, but Henry ignores. Instead, he continues to observe Christina, and when she leaves a free donut untouched instead of devouring it like the rest of the class, he storms out of the classroom, enraged, and heads straight for the principal's office. In the office, Henry, clearly outraged, tries to persuade Janice, the principal, that Christina is being abused by her stepfather, Glenn. Nonetheless, instead of taking action, Janice shuts down Henry by stating that Glenn is the police commissioner, and as such, she will not accuse him of child abuse unless there is clear evidence to back up the claim. Henry, frustrated, tells her that he will handle the situation himself. That afternoon, Susan picks the kids up late again, and after they stop by Sheila's, the family of three head to the grocery store. In the store, when Henry notices a man abusing his partner, Susan tells him to look away because their intervention will only make matters worse. Back at home, while Peter and Susan unload the groceries, Henry goes inside and calls Child Protective Services anonymous report line. Before hanging up, he quickly gives them Christina's address in Glenn's name. After that, Henry goes outside to assist with the grocery delivery. As he reaches for a paper bag, Christina approaches him and offers him her medal to replace the one Maurice broke as they talk. Susan appears and strikes up a conversation with Christina about the upcoming talent show. Eventually, it is decided that Susan will drive Christina to the show, while Glenn will pick her up a few days later. George Cycleman, who Henry later learns is Glenn's relative's social services director, arrives at Glenn's door to investigate Henry's claims. Instead of investigating Christina, the man stands on the porch, exchanges pleasantries with Glenn, and barely looks at her. Henry uses binoculars to monitor the events, and he is greatly disappointed by the outcome. Shortly after George departs, Henry mounts his bicycle and embarks on a bizarre series of events. First, he rides to a bridge and stakes it out, making sure to keep a notebook of his findings. Then, he enlists his brother Peter to assist him in staking out the land surrounding their tree house. Just after that, Peter goes out and buys 2 books on crime scene investigation. With his newly purchased books in his bag, Henry rides his bike to an arms store and manages to sneak in unnoticed. Inside, he witnesses an illegal weapon sale and documents the details in his notebook. Later that night, Susan is awakened by Peter's screams and rushes into her son's room to find Henry on the ground having a seizure. Peter dials 911 and Henry is taken to the hospital after telling the doctor that he has had a persistent headache for several months. The necessary tests are run, and the doctor realizes that he has a mass in his head. Following this discovery, the doctor informs Susan that Henry needs urgent surgery. With Peter and Susan by his side, Henry spends the night in the hospital. In the morning, the doctor asks to speak to Henry and Susan privately with a deep regret. He reveals that he has a brain tumor and Henry needs to see the MRI. He comes to realize nothing can be done and asks to be left alone after he has accepted his fate. Henry continues to read his crime-solving books, pausing only to draw arrows on a sketch of the bridge he had seen earlier in his notebook. As time passes, the family of 3 is covered in gloom, and Susan and Peter try to spend as much time as possible with Henry. One day, while they are all together in the hospital room, Henry asks Peter to bring him some ice cream after Peter leaves. Henry wants Susan to bring him the family's financial statements and other documents, so he can go over them one last time. Susan, on the other hand, becomes emotional and exits the room when Peter returns with the ice cream. The 2 brothers decide they don't want it any longer. Instead, Henry begs Peter to make sure that their mother reads his red notebook after he dies. The talk becomes emotional, and the 2 brothers sob in each other's arms. Susan does as Henry instructed the next day and brings their financial documents to him in the hospital while he works on his computer. Henry tries to give his mother a crash course in investment and stock monitoring, but she is upset, stating she is uninterested in any of those things. Susan finally calms down and apologizes for her actions, and the 2 share an emotional moment that night. Henry dies in Susan's arms, and his family is in mourning. Christina helps in bringing Peter home from school, and he falls asleep in Henry's bed while holding his walkie-talkie. Susan enters the room, tears in her eyes, turns off the walkie-talkie, and kisses Peter goodnight. The following day when Peter gets home from school, he finds his mother baking up a storm. As the 2 talks about Henry's death, Susan loses control and suffers a mental breakdown. Peter tries to console her, but they are cut off by the doorbell. When Susan opens the door, she sees Dr. Daniels, the doctor who cared for Henry in the hospital. Seeing Susan's being surprised, he reminds her of their appointment and informs her that he has come to check on her and Peter. Susan lets Dr. Daniels into the kitchen, and when he sees Peter, he rushes over to ensure his safety. The doctor gives him his card and tells him to contact him whenever he wants. Susan returns to work shortly after Henry's death. But, after she drinks half a customer's Coke to see if it has died, her boss tells her that she resumed too soon, and that she should take more time off after school that day. Peter goes straight home to the bedroom he once shared with his brother while sitting on the bed. He notices Henry's red notebook and recalls his brother's instructions. Peter quickly picks up the book and begins flipping through it. Immediately, Susan returns home. Peter runs down the stairs with the red notebook in hand and hand it over. He informs his mother that he believes Henry wants Glenn killed. After looking through the book, Susan learns that Glenn abuses his stepdaughter, Christina. She also discovers that, prior to his death, Henry tried every conventional method available to help Christina, but they were all futile, which is why he devised his foolproof plan. At first, Susan refuses to follow Henry's plans, believing that there must be an alternative. However, after exhausting all conventional methods, she runs into a brick wall. That night, Susan goes to tuck Peter into bed, and from the bedroom window, she witnesses Glenn abusing Christina. Now determined to help Christina in any way possible, Susan returns to Henry's book, and the first step, according to the book, is to open the safe. So, Susan heads downstairs. In the safe, she finds a tape on which Henry has pre-recorded a message. Henry tells his mother that he snuck out of the hospital to put everything in place, and that all she has to do now is follow his instructions. Susan leaves the house the next day with earphones in her ears, listening to Henry's instructions. The first step is to stockpile cash, which she does by visiting 2 different ATMs. Step 2 is to buy a weapon, so with the money in her pocket, Susan heads to the arms store that Henry had stated earlier. After name-dropping a name that Henry picked up during his stakeout, Susan is allowed to purchase the exact gun that Henry describes in the Step 3 on tape is target practice. Susan returns home and makes her way to the boys' treehouse in the woods. There, she practices her shooting skills by following the instructions on Henry's tape. Susan calls it quits after hours of practice and moves on to the next step. She walks to the front door and finds Glenn raking leaves on his lawn. She tells him she wants to speak with him inside, so he invites her in. Susan says hello to Christina briefly, before sitting down with Glenn without hesitation. She asks Glenn if he has a plan in place for Christina if something happens to him, and he says no to avoid suspicion. Susan explains that she intends to set up such a plan for Peter and that she needs guidance. Before taking her leave, Susan asks Glenn to sign a form authorizing her to take Christina to the talent show, and he agrees. Back at home, Susan is busy forging Glenn's signature for a witness document, but Peter walks in on her, surprised, and quickly puts the papers away before taking Peter back to bed. The mother and son talk about the next day's talent show, and Peter reveals that he will be performing a magic trick. The day comes, and she keeps her promise. Susan drives Christina and Peter to the talent show. At the show, Susan runs into Dr. Daniels, and Peter reveals that he invited the doctor. Just as the show starts, Susan sneaks out and sets her stopwatch to 45 minutes. She drives home into the treehouse, where she sets up the gun she'd been practicing with. Susan then proceeds to bait Glenn out of his house by whistling into a walkie-talkie setup. All set as planned, Glenn goes outside to investigate the whistling noises. As he walks around, Glenn walks directly into the spot where Susan wants him, but just before she pulls the trigger, she sees pictures of Henry as a baby and comes to realize how ridiculous the whole thing is, so she comes to her senses. Susan steps out of the treehouse, only to find Glenn waiting for her outside, sight the gun she was holding. He asks for an explanation instead of explaining. Susan tells Glenn that she is aware of everything he has done, and that she will go to any length to expose him. Unfazed by this revelation, Glenn tells Susan that no one will believe her and threatens to have her arrested using his position as police commissioner. At the talent show, it is Christina's turn to perform, and when she steps onto the stage, she performs a sad dance that brings tears to Principal Janice's eyes. Susan follows Henry's plan and drives to the bridge he staked out earlier, tossing the gun. Thereafter, she begins feeding back to his house's elementary school. Glenn calls his friend in the police department to ask for his help and keep Susan quiet, but he gets a rude shock instead. His friend informs him that he has been reported for child abuse by Principal Janice, and that an investigation will be opened because the case is too big. He notices that the police are already at his house and decides not to face the humiliation, so he pulls out a gun and shoots himself. Susan turns up at school just in time for Peter's trick when she walks into the hall. Her young son is excited in the spotlight and enjoying the cheers from the crowd when the show ends. Susan, Peter, and Dr. Daniel are standing in the hallway, having a small talk, when they are interrupted by the sound of police sirens in the distance, worried that the cops have come for her. Susan excuses herself and walks outside, where she runs into Janice, who is standing with the cops. Susan, clearly confused, asks Janice, what is going on? The elementary school principal tells her that Glenn committed suicide and that Christina is being questioned by a social worker. Weeks after the incident, the court grants Susan full custody of Christina. Just after then Susan, Christina and Peter soon start living as one big happy family. The end. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to see more movie updates.